I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles this morning to John chapter 21. John chapter 21. I already told Joe, but here you go. How many Georgia Tech fans are in the room? Okay, well, God bless you. But I did want to just start by telling you some amazing news about Georgia Tech. 94 years ago today, on New Year's Day, 1929, Georgia Tech played the University of California in the Rose Bowl, Tech's first ever postseason bowl game, after an amazing season that included big wins over Notre Dame and Georgia. And in that 1929 Rose Bowl game, a California Golden Bear who played the position back then of roving center, today's middle linebacker, named Roy Riegels. There's Roy. Good-looking fella, isn't he? Recovered a fumble from Georgia Tech. Somehow, Roy became confused. And he started running, and he ran, and he ran. 65 yards he ran in the wrong direction. But thankfully, one of his teammates, Benny Loam, outdistanced him and tackled Roy Riegels on the 1 yard line just before he scored for Georgia Tech, preventing the touchdown. When California attempted to punt, Tech blocked the kick and they scored a safety, which ended up being the ultimate margin of victory. Roy Riegels would become known as Wrong Way Roy, and they even made kids' books about this guy. Can you imagine being Roy Riegels? But that game wasn't over. That strange play came in the first half, and everyone who was watching the game was asking the same question: what will Coach Nibs Price do with Roy Riegels in the second half? The men filed off the field and went into the dressing room for halftime. They sat down on the benches and on all the floors, but everybody but Riegels. Roy put his blanket around his shoulders, sat down in the corner, put his face in his hands, and cried like a baby. Now, you know, generally the halftime talk is some more of a talk. That day, Coach Price was very quiet. No doubt he was trying to figure out what to do with Riegels. Then the timekeeper came in and announced that there were 3 minutes before playing time, and Coach Price looked at the team and said simply, this is all he said the whole halftime: men, the same team that played the first half will start the second. The players got up and started out, all but Riegels. He didn't budge. The coach looked back and called to him again. Still, he didn't move, didn't say a word. Coach Price went over to where Riegels sat and said, "Roy, did you not hear me? The same team that played the first half will start the second." Then Roy Riegels looked up and his cheeks were wet with a strong man's tears. He said, "Coach, I can't do it to save my life. I've ruined you. I've ruined the University of California. I've ruined myself. I couldn't face that crowd in the stadium to save my life." Then Coach Price reached out and put his hand on Roy's shoulder and said to him, "Roy, get up and go on back. The game is only half over." And Roy went back. And boy, did he play. He turned in a stellar second half performance, including blocking a Tech punt. Now, Georgia Tech went on to win that game 8-7. But those Georgia Tech men would have told you that they've never seen a man play football like Roy Riegels played the second half of that game. Have you ever failed at something? Okay. We all have failed. You remember how it feels? You can identify with Roy Riegels. Maybe you've never played football in your life, but you know what that feels like. Can you still feel that knot of shame, maybe even guilt inside that you felt when you failed? You know, we're at that time of New Year's resolutions, aren't we? Y'all made any? Now, let me just go ahead and say there's nothing wrong with some fresh goals, some reprioritizing of your lives. In fact, I would encourage you, renewing some good spiritual disciplines in our lives is a good way to start the year. But too often, as Tully and Chavijan puts it, New Year's resolutions are a burdening attempt to fix ourselves and make ourselves more lovable. But here's the good news. God loves us as we are, not as we should be. Jack Miller made this statement about New Year's resolutions. He said, "The only New Year's resolution I make every year is to collapse more fully on Christ. I trust in His resolve, not mine." And that's what I want you to see this morning. I want to talk to you this morning about a friend of sinners. In John chapter 21, verses 1 through 22, what we're going to learn from these verses and the story of this conversation between Jesus and Peter is very simply this. Jesus chooses, forgives, and uses failures. Because, folks, that's all He's got to work with. A friend for failures. Listen to the text in John 21, verse 1. After this, Jesus revealed Himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and He revealed Himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of His disciples were there. Now, Jesus and a few of these fellas had been right here on this same beach before. Back in Matthew chapter 4, early on, we read these words, "While walking by the Sea of Galilee, He saw 2 brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And He said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' Immediately they left their nets and followed Him." You see, this beach on the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, it's the same lake, it's where it all started. It was the place of Peter's original calling. Our text in John 21 continues in verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered Him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, the author of this gospel, the disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. And when they got on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it and bread. Now, if you remember the story from the early parts of the Gospels, you realize this was a deja vu moment for these guys. Luke's account of Peter's calling, along with that of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, as found over in Luke 5, verses 1 through 11, Luke's account of Peter's original calling includes this same kind of encounter with Jesus. Fishing all night by themselves, catching nothing. Then Jesus gives them instructions, and suddenly their nets are so full that they can hardly drag them in. So don't miss this. This entire scene of Jesus, the risen Christ now, telling, you remember what He said? Tell the disciples, He sent instructions by the women to tell the disciples to do what? Anybody remember? Go to Galilee. This whole scene of Jesus sending the disciples ahead of Him to Galilee after His resurrection and then appearing to them here in our text. It was all perfectly orchestrated by Jesus to remind Peter especially of where He had started with Jesus. And to teach Peter this lesson, Jesus chooses failures. Jesus called Peter knowing full well what would happen later on. In John 21, verse 10, the story continues. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. The implication of that verse is what? The net should have torn. There was too many fish in the net for it not to tear under normal circumstances. And yet, just to add to the miracle of the catching of the fish is the preservation of the net in the hands of Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Peter was hurt here, wasn't he? He's hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And then Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." 3 times, back and forth it goes. Why all this repetition? What's going on here? Well, do you remember the conversation between Jesus and Peter at the Lord's Supper? Back in Luke, over in Luke 22, verse 31. Sitting there at the Lord's table the night before Jesus died, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon," speaking to Peter, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Peter said to him, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death." Jesus said, "I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times. 3 times. You'll deny that you know me." And only hours later, Peter did deny Jesus, not once, not twice, but you guessed it, 3 times. Just like Jesus said he would. You see, Jesus chooses failures, and Jesus forgives failures. 3 times, Jesus asked Peter that question, "Do you love me?" But here's the thing, our English Bibles do not do the questions being asked justice. The first 2 times that Jesus asked the question, he uses the word agapeo in Greek, agape love. You've heard that. It's the deepest word possible for love, if love can even be defined. It's a self-sacrificing, voluntary, unconditional love, like a mother for a child or a husband for his new bride. Do you love me like you said you love me? Jesus is asking. Enough to die for me. Now, Peter, do you love me enough to die for me? Peter responds, "You know I love you," in English. But he doesn't use the same word Jesus does. Jesus says, "Do you agapeo me?" Peter answers and says, "Jesus, you know I phileo you. You know I love you," but it's a different word for love. It's the word from which we get the name Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. He essentially says in response, "Lord, you know I'm your friend." Jesus is asking a question, do you love me enough to die for me today? To which Peter can only respond, "You know I love you like a brother. You know I love you like a friend." The third time then, Jesus changes the question. He uses Peter's word of choice. "Okay, Simon, son of John, are you really my friend?" And this cuts Simon Peter to the heart. Why? Because Jesus is plowing over ground that's been broken by desertion and betrayal in Peter's life. Peter can say to Jesus, yes, you are my friend. But he knows he cannot prove anything beyond that. He cannot truthfully say, yes, I love you enough to die for you, to do anything you ask, to give myself up for you, because when he was given the chance to do just that, he failed 3 times. But here's the beauty of this conversation. Jesus doesn't bring all of this back up to pour salt into Peter's wounds, his wounds of failure. Jesus asked Peter this question 3 times, once for every denial, once for every failure. But he does it to give Peter a chance to reaffirm his love. These aren't words of condemnation or rebuke. These are words of restoration. Peter had been living with the guilt and shame of his failure to love Jesus. And Jesus comes and restores Peter. Remember what Jesus said to Peter back in Luke 22? I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Listen. And when you have turned again, this is Jesus coming to Peter and turning him again. When you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. You get the parallel in our text in John 21, right? Feed my sheep. Shame overwhelms and paralyzes us, doesn't it, when we fail? And if we'll let it, if left to ourselves, we just sink deeper and deeper in despair by the shame, because of the shame, because of the guilt. Paralysis turns into just despair. But Jesus comes to us, just like he did to Peter, with a heart full of grace and forgiveness. Jesus comes to us to put our past behind us, even when we can't put our past behind us, even when nobody else around us wants to let us put our past behind us. The grace of Christ comes to us to restore us. Jesus chooses and forgives failures. Amen. Are you awake? Because I don't know about you, I'm one of those, and know it or not, you are too, and this is good news this morning, amen? Victory and power begin to come into our lives as we collapse into the merciful and gracious arms of Jesus. Sometimes we think victory and power come when we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, when we make that resolution that we're going to do better, we're going to live for Jesus more consistently this year in our own strength. We're going to do such and such. Victory and power begin to come into our lives as we collapse into the merciful and gracious arms of Jesus. God-glorifying faithfulness and fruit in our lives begins to be born when we accept the grace of God in Christ and when we rely on that grace as our only hope and our only strength. Jesus chooses and forgives failures. John 21, verse 18. Jesus says to Peter, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God, that is Peter. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me. Follow me." Peter, the first half's over. It's time to play the second half. Jesus chooses, forgives, and uses failures. Peter, let's start over. We're going to go back to where it all started, on that beach by the Sea of Galilee. And here, just like you did then, but in a new way now, receive my love. Receive my grace and power. I'm putting your past behind you. All is forgiven, Peter. You're restored. I'm going to use you as you depend on me this time for what you need to be used by me. So, Peter, just follow me. Can't you imagine the thoughts, the questions that ran through Peter's mind? What if I fail? Follow me, Jesus said. What if I lose my way? Just follow me. What if the path is not what I expected? Well, it won't be, Peter, but just follow me anyway. What if it hurts? It will, Peter. Follow me. What if the result is hardship and even death? Yes, Peter, that's exactly what's going to happen. You are going to die for me. And that's what he told him about having his hand stretched out. Just follow me. And follow Jesus. Peter did. God used Peter in the days that followed to preach mightily at Pentecost, where some 3,000 people were saved by the hand of God. God used Peter over and over in the book of Acts to introduce folks to his risen Savior. I think of the house of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. God used Peter to write 2 letters in the New Testament to encourage churches. You see, Jesus chooses, forgives, and uses failures. What amazing grace, amen? Again, Chavijan says, God always meets my messes with His mercy, my failures with His forgiveness, and my guilt with His grace. Real freedom is living life from love rather than for love. The gospel is that you and I, when we trust in Jesus, from that moment forward, only have to live life from love. We are loved. We are fully known and fully loved. And we live out of that place. We live out of that position. We live out of that relationship that He's graciously given to us, where we are called children of God. Are you carrying failure that you're allowing to spiritually paralyze you this morning? Do you think that your failure cannot be forgiven? Do you think there's no way Jesus could use you anymore because your failure is just too big? It's not true. Just think of it. Peter looked men and women in the eye and said out loud, I don't know who Jesus is. He denied Him 3 times. And yet God forgave, restored, and went on to use Peter in power. John Bloom says, Peter's failure did not define him. And it doesn't have to define you. It was a horrible, humbling stumble along the path of following Jesus. But you see, when Jesus died on the cross, He completely paid for the sin of Peter's denial. And before He ever went to the cross, He knew He would be paying for that sin. As soon as He rose from the dead, the angel told Mary to tell His disciples and Peter, the only one He names by name, a message of personal grace from Jesus via the angel to Peter. Not guilty was the final word for Peter. Oh, Peter knew he didn't deserve acquittal. But Jesus had settled Peter's account with the Father and given him guiltlessness as a free gift of love once and for all. You see, he was not Peter the denier, but Peter the forgiven. Roy Ruggles really never overcame Wrong way, Roy. In fact, later in life, he would hear about a young high school football player who did the exact same thing. And you can look it up on the internet if you want to. He actually wrote that young man a letter encouraging him about how, though he's had to put up with wrong way Roy his whole life goes on. He never overcame that. But see, you don't have to be Peter the denier. You can be, as Peter was, the forgiven. I'm Chad, the forgiven. There's a lot of sin that I could identify in, try to have as my identity. There's a lot of things that I've done. There's a lot. My past is like your past. It's full of failure before holy God. And yet God chooses, forgives, and uses failures. As an old man, Peter would truly serve Christ. And in the process, he would die for his faith. He would actually keep that impulsive promise he once made and 3 times denied. If everyone else abandons you, I will not. I will die for you. Peter ultimately did come to that kind of maturity and true agape love for his Lord. He was martyred and killed because he loved Jesus and he wouldn't deny him no matter what. Some 35 years after this conversation here in John 21, Jesus' prophecy about Peter's death became reality. And under the Neronian persecutions, the aged Simon Peter was condemned to death. Just as his Lord had died, Peter was crucified on a cross. Yet historians say he was crucified upside down at his own request, for he did not consider himself worthy to die as Jesus had died. Jesus chooses, forgives, and uses failures. He takes the weak and by His grace makes them strong. The Church of Jesus Christ is a fellowship of forgiven failures being used for the glory of God. That's a great definition of the church. The Church of Jesus Christ is a group of forgiven failures being used for the glory of God. And in Peter, Jesus shows us how He can transform a failure into a rock of strength for His church. How is it? How can He do this? How can God use guys like Peter that blow it so bad? Collapsed in the arms of Jesus. And there, empowered by the Spirit of his beloved Lord, Peter became a humble, encouraging, suffering, and persevering disciple of Jesus. And he became a bold ambassador of the gospel of forgiveness to the most miserable failures in his world. You see, Jesus this morning is calling us to follow Him from this place of dependence as well this morning. You remember Jesus' words back in John 15, verse 5? What did Jesus say there? I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do what? Nothing. Apart from Jesus, Peter had done nothing. He failed every time he tried. But then, after that day on the beach in John 21, he began to abide in the vine. He maintained that relational connection to Jesus. He depended on the risen Christ and the power of the resurrection to give him the strength to do what Jesus had called him to do. Before, Peter tried to love Jesus on his own without God's grace and strength, and he failed miserably. After, he leaned hard on Jesus for the grace to love Jesus, and God used him mightily. Paul put it this way in Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. And let me just tell you, that's not about a football game or a basketball game. Are y'all tracking with me? That's about doing the stuff Jesus calls us to do that we can't do on our own. Paul said, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Christ must, and He will, give us the strength we need to trust and obey Him, or else we can't trust and obey Him. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, Paul said this about himself and his ministry. He said, for I'm the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. You know what Paul did? He had Christians killed. He hated the name of Jesus before God, even the risen Christ, radically saved and transformed him. I'm not even worthy to be called apostle, Paul says, because I persecuted the church of God. Verse 10, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And His grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Paul said, I'm not worthy to be called an apostle, but that's what God's made me, by His grace. And by that same grace, I've worked harder. I've been a more consistent, earnest missionary than all the other 12 ever were, the other 11 that remained ever were. But it's not me. It's the grace of God in me. You see, Christ must empower by His grace and His indwelling Spirit whatever it is that He calls us to. And He will, if we'll let Him. Jesus chooses, forgives, and uses failures. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10, we read it at the beginning of the service. We'll close with this passage. Jesus speaking to Paul. You remember the context here. Paul, as he tells us, had a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what it is. Some think it was poor eyesight. Others think it was some sort of demonic oppression through an enemy, perhaps. We don't know. It doesn't really matter. But 3 times, Paul went to Jesus and prayed, take this thing away. Lord, if there's any way, take this thorn out of my flesh. It's slowing me down. It's paining me. But Jesus answered in verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. Not going to take it away, Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I'm not taking the thorn out, Paul, because my grace is sufficient for you to deal with that thorn. And in your weakness, my power is perfected. When there is this thorn in your life and you're having to deal with it through my strength, it's right there that you see the fullness, the completeness of my power given to you. And so what does Paul say? Therefore, because Jesus said that, because Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness, because Jesus said that, therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. None of us like weakness. None of us like insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. And yet Paul said, I've learned to be content with those things, because here's what I learned from Jesus. It's when I am weak and having to deal with things that highlight my weakness, it is then that I'm strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. It's when I boast of my weakness, that's when the power of Christ can come. In other words, when I forget pretending to be strong enough to handle it, whatever it is, and just acknowledge I can't handle it. I don't have this. This is too much for me. I cannot be like Jesus in the middle of this. unless He gives me the strength to do it. Jesus said, Paul says, that's where the power of the resurrection comes into our lives. That's when He does what only He can do in and through us. Will you thank God for choosing you to receive His love and grace? This morning, will you refuse to remain paralyzed by guilt and shame and accept His forgiveness for whatever your failure this morning? Scriptures tell us that if we will call on the name of the Lord, we'll be saved. The Scriptures tell us that because of what Jesus has done, there is therefore now no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. Scriptures tell us that through His life, death, and resurrection, Jesus purchased our eternal forgiveness. Don't call God a liar by refusing His forgiveness. Don't say Jesus did not pay it all by refusing to receive the forgiveness that came from that payment. And then this morning, will you resolve to daily acknowledge your weakness and collapse into Jesus' grace and strength as you surrender your life for His use in the new year? I don't know about you, but I like that resolution that we talked about at the beginning, Jack Miller. The only resolution I want to make this year is to collapse more into the arms of Jesus, because I trust His resolve. I trust His power, not my own.